Welcome to Cuke Audio Podcast, a presentation of Cuke Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his. And anything else that comes to mind. My name is David Chadwick, and I'm the Poobah of Cuke Archives. I'm speaking to you from Sanur with Doggett, Bandita, and Feline Cuchita at my side. Dear Katrinka is in America, and no plane's gonna land here with her for a while. So I appreciate your being here to keep me company in my self-isolation. Before we go any further, I must thank our sponsor. This program is brought to you through the generous support of you, our dear listeners. We are most grateful. Thank you. May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. We're 2 minutes now into the 7th full-length podcast. With these new mini podcasts, it sort of throws the numbering off, in my mind anyway. And now it's time for the table of contents, immediately followed by an indefinite amount of meditation. It's indefinite, but since it occurs while the audio is paused, we know that life in Bali, which includes the virus report, the accident report, and the feeding of the monsters, begins at 5 minutes and 56 seconds. That's followed by Dear Dave at 24 minutes and 40 seconds. A phone chat with Suzuki and Trungpa student Paul Shippey was scheduled to take place next, but the podcast is so long and the phone conversation is so long and so good that we're going to put that up as a separate podcast in a couple of days. So at 28 minutes exactly, we will have the reading of Chapter 3 of Crooked Cucumber, The Life and Zen Teaching of Shunryu Suzuki. Comments on Chapter 3 begin at 1 hour, 42 minutes, and 7 seconds, and are concluded with bloopers at 2 hours, 12 minutes, and 16 seconds, which leads to the dramatic conclusion of our podcast, which vanishes into nothingness at 2 hours, 21 minutes, and 56 seconds. Okay, so before we go any further, let's have a little meditation. At the sound of the bell, just hit pause. Meditate for as long as you like. Zazen, Vipassana, TM, chanting, whatever you want for as long as you want or as short as you want. And when you're through, unpause, and the bell to end meditation will ring. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable. Here in Bali, the official virus count remains very, very low, moving very, very slowly up. Still only 4 deaths. There's 314 positives counted, which we know is way below what there is, but still, there's the hospitals aren't busy. There's not more cremations, etc. But wow, are they taking it serious? The beaches are still closed, and now they've closed Denpasar when they've got these checkpoints. We live on the edge of Denpasar, but I guess they're talking about Denpasar proper. So this was sent to me by neighbor Yvonne. It's an official announcement starting from May 15th to the 14th of June 2020 for people who want to enter and exit Denpasar must carry a clear identity and have a good reason, purpose for their trip. The border area will be guarded by a joint team of police, TNI, Dishub, I don't know what either of them are, Pechalang, that's the neighborhood security force or service force, Task Force COVID-19 and Public Health Office. Regarding PKM, restricting community activities, 11 points were made integrated monitoring posts, namely, they list the 11 places that they're going to have posts where you enter and exit Denpasar. And then it says targets to be targeted are motorists without masks, crowds, store operating hours, community movements without clear objectives, four-wheeled vehicles full of passengers, goods vehicles, online transport control, body temperature checks conducted by sampling merchants' impromptu cars until the movement back home. Okay. Our friend Oren from Java got stopped by Pechalang and she didn't have a mask on. And they gave her a choice. 8 days of community service or a fine of 50,000, which she happily gave them. 50,000 rupiah here is about $3.25. I take Bondi for a walk just about every day. Sarah hadn't been able to come recently because she's so busy with work, which is good. But every time I go out, it's like I lock the gate and we start walking down and I go, at some point we get out there on the street and then all of a sudden I feel naked and I go, lupa, 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 which means I forgot. And then we turn around and she doesn't like that. She wants to keep going. She doesn't want to go back home. We turn around and I go back in and get a mask on and go out. One time I didn't think about it until I was, a couple of minutes down the street and a woman went by on a bicycle and she had a mask on, and I went, ah, and he put my hand on my face, and a guy across the street laughed. Now, one explanation for the low virus count is there's been an astounding number of dengue cases. And they think, well, maybe a lot of them were actually the virus, but still, the hospitals aren't super busy or anything. So we'll see. We're just waiting. Katrinka has a reservation to come in on June 4th. The airport is supposed to open in June. Now, she's got a resident visa. You have to have a residence visa to get in or be a resident or have, some diplomatic reason or something. But I suspect they're going to cancel that flight too. We'll see. Hey, time for another accident report. I had another accident just a week ago, Wednesday. A small one, but it drew blood. Pardon me. But it was really unusual. It was bizarre. I had just finished cutting some fruit up, and I was putting the knife over by the sink to wash, and as I reached my hand over to the right to do so, it slipped out of my hand and was falling toward the floor. And I instinctively, when I drop things, whip my hand over to catch them. And frequently I catch things when I've dropped them, and I always go, cool. And I go, thank you. I always thank my, my bigger self for helping me do anything. I do it all day long. So when I brought my hand over, that's really quick. That's quite a lot of force. Now, you might think I impaled my hand there. Nope. I happened to hit where the knife was. I mean, this happened without me thinking, If I thought, I wouldn't have done it. The way the knife was in the air when I hit it was perfectly horizontal with the butt end, the handle end, on the right, where my right hand was coming from, and the sharp blade on the left, with the blade pointing down. And so when I hit it, it was like I batted it, and it went straight, bang, into the wall to the left, just straight across. I went, wow. And then I looked down at my finger, and my finger was bleeding on my left hand because my left hand was out for balance. The right, I can see it barely now. The index finger, the blade passed right over it and cut right through it on its way over. So then I looked down and I was dripping blood, and I went, wow. So, I got a sort of paper towel and, folded it over so it was like a long ribbon and wrapped it around and held it till it stopped and put on a Band-Aid. And, I put on some red medicine, they called it. It was like mercurochrome or something. And it's fine now. I can hardly see it. So that's this week's accident report. Today, Life in Bali has two guests, Bandi and Kuchi, or more formally called Bandita and Kuchita. So here we go with dinner time for them, or as Katrinka and I call it, time to feed the monsters. Makanan dinner! She's going crazy. She's dancing around Coochie, nipping at her. Coochie likes it. Hey. here we are. So I open the refrigerator and I get out. This is for you, Bundy, and this is for Gucci. And then I open the pantry. They're both looking at me raptly right now. And I get out this, the dry food. And open it up, and I have to make sure to seal it well, or a mouse will open it up and get in there. That mouse probably doesn't have long to go here if Gucci gets wise to it. She'll start laying in wait for it. I don't really worry about it. Katrinka wants me to check under the stove to make sure there's not dropping there. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Dancing around Gucci. Nipping at her. Gucci striking at Bondi. She knows just what's going to happen. She doesn't want to do it. She runs ahead and gets on her shelf and waits. Okay, now Gucci's on her shelf in the bedroom where Bondi can't get. Meanwhile, Bondi has jumped onto the bed and is eagerly watching this stage of the feeding. She grabbed her ball, her play ball, little orange ball that's it's not full of air, just somewhat, so she can sink her teeth into it and shake it around and jump around with it. She'll do that at feeding time when she's not attacking Coochie. Run feverishly around with the ball in circles or something, and up and down with it, and then drop it, and then drink, take a few laps of water. Taking laps of water is something she does when she gets excited. Do that and then run off to something else. And there's that, Cuchita. All right. Doing. And a little dry food over there, which she doesn't need, but she likes it to be put there. Makes her feel more secure. All right. Back to the kitchen. And okay, now we're going to get your food ready. And I get the dish. The customary ringing of the dish on the side of the rolling table. Right, I'm sitting here editing this brief little audio which I recorded with my iPhone, and when the dish hit, not really a dish, it's a small stainless steel bowl, and made that ringing sound. Bonnie's lying down on the floor near me here. Boy, her head popped up and her ears were up, and she looked at me like... She can be out in front by the gate. She likes to sit by the gate. Anyway, she sits by there waiting for people to walk by so she can protect us from them. And anyway, all the way back in the house, and I can drop one little pellet of her dog food in the dish, and it's better than calling her. And she'll be there in just a second. Wait, yeah. And she's also watching me rapidly now as I edit this. When she hears her name being repeated, and then she hears herself barking, she looks at me, and she's really puzzled. There, I open your food. All right. Here we go. We wouldn't even have animals if it were up to me, but now that we've got them, of course, I'm in love with them and can't live without them. But when Coochie was a feral cat, and when she first showed up here, well, not here at our prior place, there were a lot of feral cats and dogs around there. You start feeding one, and that's it. You're committed. So when she first showed up, I just got some water in a bucket and threw it at her. run off. But then, when I wasn't there, the trinket, here you are, Bundy. She's very excited, jumping up and down. Honey, and now she's eating it. When I wasn't looking, actually I have no control over Katrina, didn't matter if I was looking or not. She started feeding Coochie, and so Coochie became our cat. But she was a wild cat. She would have one litter after another of kittens, and of course, they'd all disappear. I mean, there was a big field across the street, and there were feral cats and stray dogs around there, and they didn't last so long. But she did. But then finally, we caught her and had her spayed. No, you idiot! You didn't have her spayed. You had her fixed. Males get spayed. And so she sort of became our cat, but she was still sort of feral. Both of us had to get rabies shots. You cannot get scratched by any animal here without getting a rabies shot immediately. Rabies is 100% effective. I mean, it'll kill you 100% of the time. The vaccine for it is also 100% effective, and all you have to do is get it before you have symptoms. If you have symptoms, you're in for a horrible final week of your life, with like one or maybe two exceptions in recorded human history. One woman was put in a coma for a year and came out, and she lived. That was some experimental thing. But I want to elaborate here a little. The reason we had to get the rabies shots was it wasn't just like a minor scratch. She drew blood, scratching and biting both of us. I mean, and she wasn't doing it out of anger. She just didn't know how to relate to people. She was sort of being affectionate, I think. But, that went on for the first year. She doesn't do that. Well, every once in a while she'll take a little nip out of me. And I don't like it, man. I just throw her off, She does that. Yeah, and we'd tell people, hey, don't mess with her. But now she's all right. That is the most exciting time of Bundy's day. I would say so, yes. So back when we got those rabies shots, because she was clawing and biting us, I read a little about rabies, and I read about it here. And when I, did a web search for rabies in Bali, mainly what came up was monkey bites. Yeah, people would go to the monkey forest in Ubud. What the most popular one, there's another one that's really nice, Sangre, I think it's called. It's about 40 minutes from Ubud. It's different. It's more spread out. Yeah, what's happened to me there at Sangre is I'll be standing looking at something, and it's more flat. The monkey forest in Ubud, you go down to a river and stuff, and then you're always around people or monitors there. Anyway, I was standing in front of something, looking at it, and bang, big old monkey jumped right on my back. And that's happened there more than once. And, when they do that, you just don't move. They're okay as long as you're not doing anything to them. So when they do that, you just be still. You don't have to freeze, and they'll get off. They're just looking for food. At Sangre, I hardly ever see anybody else, just us when we're there. In Ubud, I see people, they go in and they get the monkeys on them and they want to play with them, and or they'll go, oh, how sweet, how cute, and they'll reach for a little one and the mother will attack them. Do not mess with monkeys. And now it's time for Dear Dave. I can't stop them from making it Dave instead of David. I write Dear David, and it just goes back. Next time I look, it's gone back to Dear Dave. So I've given up. Penny in Orlando writes, Dear Dave, don't chichak have germs? Well, she's talking about those little geckos, or whatever they are, that crawl around on the walls and hide behind pictures and stuff. And she misspelled it. She spelled it C-H-E-C-H-A-K. It's C-E-C-A-K. The Indonesian C is a C-H. Well, yes, Penny, I guess. I know it's really better not to touch people's pet iguanas and pet lizards, but we don't touch them, and they keep their germs themselves, and they are a blessing to the home. I hear about, and I read occasionally, people writing into some travel sites, what to do about the lizards, how to get rid of these lizards in the walls when they're visiting or something. I said, no, you don't want to. Mark in Arcata writes, Dear David, now thank you, Mark, about turning purple. The same thing has been happening to me, especially on my arms and the back of my hands, usually from slight dings or forgotten bumps. When you played that section of Purple People Eater, I remembered something that might be of interest. Tim Leary was interviewed years ago and was asked what might be the long-term effects of taking LSD, and he said something like, "Oh, I don't know. Maybe someday we'll all turn purple." Wow. Timothy Leary, visionary. And Mark sent another epistle. Dear David, I first saw this quote about a year ago in the Ring of Bone Zendo newsletter. I thought it would be a nice way of opening the question you brought up of what would Buddha do? Don't try to follow the tracks left by the ancestors. Search for what they searched for. Matsuo Basho, 1644 to 1694. Basho, the great poet. Thank you, Mark. Crooked Cucumber, The Life and Zen Teaching of Shunryu Suzuki, Chapter 3, Higher Education, 1924 to 1930. Even a mistaken approach is not a waste of time. In April 1924, Shunryu Suzuki was almost 20. Having skipped his last year at Kaisei, he was now a junior at the Soto Preparatory School in Tokyo, living in the dorm and studying hard. In terms of age, he was still way behind because of all the time he'd spent serving Soon and helping with the two temples. But that was not considered a handicap. This school was attached to the Soto College, where Soto Zen monks from all over Japan came to get the degrees now required by the government. Shoganji wasn't far away. One Sunday, on the way back to school after visiting home, Shunryu got off the train in Yokohama to see a section of the bustling port city that was said to have a few fine shops selling antique ceramics. Dressed in his quasi-military style school uniform, he ambled about, following his fancy and eating an occasional sweet. One shop led to another, and one street to the next, and by he found himself among storefronts exhibiting all kinds of imports, clothes, shoes, jewelry, records, and books. He looked long at a magazine that had photographs of San Francisco and carefully made out the captions below. He wandered on past sidewalk tables full of Japanese items bound for export, cups, paintings, umbrellas, toys, and tables, and all of it junk, tasteless, gaudy junk. He felt a profound embarrassment that this was what Japan was offering to the world. It wasn't really Japanese. It was superficial, pseudo-Japanese. Shunryu thought about what he considered really Japanese: handmade crafts, furniture, scrolls, and ceramics that embodied the culture and traditions that would add to the harmony of the house they went to. Then he had a little epiphany. If only he could go abroad and bring to foreign people not the worst of Japan, but the best. Something truly Japanese that could be applied to another culture. The best way to do this would be to completely understand Zen first, and then bring Zen to others. Maybe, he thought, maybe I could do that. In early July, Shunryu was hanging out on a sweltering, muggy Sunday afternoon with his friends Kundo and Araki, playing Go, sweating and fanning himself. He was a man now, over 20, the age of majority in Japan. But they were still kids in school with less responsibility than they had had before they arrived. Now they had only to concentrate on their studies. Shunryu suggested that he go liberate a melon from the cold storage room in the basement of the kitchen. His fellow monks hardly agreed. Shunryu switched on the light for the basement, then for the storage room. He went in, closing the door behind him. Beneath the low ceiling were shelves filled with tubs of tofu, barrels of pickles, boxes of vegetables, fish, meat, and fruit. He picked a nice ripe melon by the wall at the end. Then he froze. Footsteps were coming down the stairs. There was no place to hide. A voice called out, "Silence." Then a click, and another click, and Shunryu was holding a melon in total darkness. He waited a moment, then started walking back toward the door. Suddenly, there was a piercing pain above his left eye. He jerked and screamed, dropped the melon, quickly got his balance and reached up. He felt sharp, cold steel and blood. He had snared himself on a hook hanging from the ceiling. He couldn't extricate himself, and every move he made worsened the situation. Finally, his breathing slowed down, and he stood there in pain like a statue, unable to budge, blood dripping down his uniform. He waited for over an hour till he heard someone coming down the steps again and called out for help. No one was angry at him for his escapade. Like him, they were worried that he'd blinded his left eye. He hadn't. The hook had gone in through the eyelid and over the eyebrow. He lay in his bed that evening, stitched up and bandaged like a pirate, and reflected on the events of the day. He ate, but something wonderful had happened. All that he would say later in his life was that he had had an important awakening experience. He wanted to return to the clear, inexpressible, and timeless calm he had felt as he stood there, dripping blood. At the time, He thought it was the Great Enlightenment. He would learn later that it was just a little one, and he would find that he could not recreate it. That was then, and this is now. For the rest of his life, he would have a nifty little arch above his left eye. From mid-November 1925 to mid-February 1926, Shunryu was in training at Kenko-in in Shizuoka City. Soon had sent him to be initiated as head monk under the guidance of Dojun Kato Roshi, offered the formal 100-day practice period that is the heart of Zen training. One of the milestones of the training is the head monk ceremony. It wasn't like being head monk at one of the major training centers where there would be many monks and teachers. There were only Kato Roshi and a few novices, and Shunryu had to continue going to school during the day. Many monks merely went through the motions of the ceremony for a few days in their home temple, an abbreviated formality to move a son closer to inheriting his father's temple. But Shunryu was head monk for a full 100 days. 9 older priests came to the culminating ceremony, some arriving a few days early to participate in the practice and help build momentum for his rite of passage. Sogaku and Soon, with a few of his disciples, were among them. On February 18th, the day of the ceremony, Shunryu walked before them all, head bowed and arms raised, holding a staff. He recited a traditional poem, saying he felt unworthy to be there. "Dragons and elephants," he concluded, "give me your questions." He thumped the staff on a block of wood. It was time to be grilled by his peers and elders in the traditional Dharma combat ceremony. The answers were classical, memorized by the head monk for his ceremony. But the timing, the delivery, how he held himself, the quality of his voice, all would add up to what sort of ceremony this would be. It was his day. He set the tone. Afterward, there were high-sounding congratulatory statements. No longer considered a novice, Shunryu was welcomed into the Society of Priests as their new young friend. We have to study with our warm heart, not just with our brain. In April of 1926, at the age of 21, Shunryu Suzuki had graduated from prep school and moved up to Soto College, which had just been named Komazawa Daigakurin, and was now a university offering a wide range of study. Mainly he was studying, but he commuted regularly to spend time with Son in Yaizu, and he could not ignore the vast and fascinating world that was springing up around him in Tokyo. Shunryu watched movies with his friends, played tennis and go, and went rowing in the bay. He studied Chinese astrology, but finally gave it up, deciding it was unnecessary to know so much about oneself. Even if it were true, he felt it was not a Buddhist practice. He went to the coffee shops and attended school in an atmosphere of dangerous ideas. He was in Tokyo at just the right time to have his curiosity and humanity fertilized. Tokyo in the 20s was an uneasy mix of the traditional, the foreign, and the experimental. The scene of a tug-of-war between old and new, with each side pulling hard since Japan's sudden emergence from isolation. Businessmen were wearing Western suits, and women in dresses mixed with those in traditional costume. Foreign tourists were no longer a complete oddity. There were trolleys, taxis, and private cars among the jinrikishas, coffee houses, and pachinko game parlors next to the noodle shops. Art and literature were breaking into new territory. Occasionally, one would see a moga and mobo, modern girl and modern boy, in their ostentatious London and New York clothes. Some older folks called it the era of ero guro nansensu, eroticism, grotesquerie, and nonsense. But to the intellectual elite, it was a new age cracking out of the shell of the repressive past. The emperor was an invalid and mentally feeble, but his son, Crown Prince Hiroshito, who had been regent since 1921, was received as one of the new liberal breed. He had gone to England and France and been photographed in stylish English clothes and a tweed cap. He was a marine biologist and, with his friend, the Prince of Wales, had helped to introduce golf to Japan. Traditionalists feared the dangerous ideas that had crept in from the West: internationalism, socialism, communal living, pacifism, democracy, anarchy, even women's rights. It wasn't quite legal to have organizations promoting radical causes, and the police discouraged them as they could, but there wasn't popular support for too much control. A little over 50 years prior, 1868, Edo had been renamed Tokyo when Emperor Meiji moved the capital there from Kyoto. Edo had been the de facto head of government, though, since 1603. Now it was the hub of the industrial giant of the East, and there were possibly more college students there than in any city on earth. Japan was now a global power that had successfully prevailed against China and Russia in previous decades, had forged a dominant role among the imperialist nations in China, had made virtual colonies of Korea and Formosa, and had supported its Western allies in defeating the Kaiser in World War I. Japanese nationalism had mellowed. There was less support for Japan's aggressive foreign interventions, which had been a little too successful in the eyes of the West. Some Japanese hadn't forgotten the humiliation of the Triple Intervention of 1895, when Japan was forced by the West to return possessions and concessions won from China, and Emperor Meiji had urged the nation to endure the unendurable and do as they were told. The ultra-nationalists and reactionaries in the military continued to wield strong influence. There was now compulsory military training in the schools. But the Prime Minister and Cabinet had the upper hand and were holding the right-wingers in check. Even in the face of insulting racist policies abroad, such as America's ban on Asian immigration and the League of Nations' refusal to acknowledge the principle of racial equality, there was pride in Japan's international role. The national self-confidence that was lost when Commodore Perry's ships caused Japan to come out of its cocoon had been largely regained. This was an exciting time for Japan, not only socially, but in terms of Buddhism as well. Most Japanese Buddhist priests saw Buddhism only in reference to their own culture and the past. But Shunryu was being reminded at the university that Buddhism was a universal religion that had already adapted to many different Asian cultures and subcultures, that it was not the sole property of priests, but could be understood by lay people as well. A number of professors at Komazawa were taking a new look at the teaching of their sect and how it might be presented to a wider audience. The president of Komazawa, Nukarya Kaiten, had just published a book on Buddhism for lay people, which created some controversy because of its simple explanation of Soto Zen and its popular appeal. Nukarya had been to Europe and America and had also written the first popular book on Zen in English, The Religion of the Samurai. Also at Komazawa, Shunryu met a professor of Pali named Shundo Tachibana, who published The Ethics of Buddhism in English that year. The first book on Dogen's thought for the general public, Dogen Shamon, Dogen the Monk, by Wasuji Tetsuro, was also published in 1926 in Japan. It was hard enough to bring actual Zen practice to Japanese. Shunryu could not imagine how one could communicate the subtleties of Buddhism to Americans and Europeans. But he was listening. When you can laugh at yourself, there is enlightenment. In his college dorm, Shunryu awoke before the sun was up, quietly slipped on some loose work clothes, and tiptoed out of the sleeping quarters in the dark. He entered the latrine, which was lined on one side with squat toilets and a long urinal, and on the other with a continuous sink with faucets every couple of feet. He crossed the room to a cabinet, took out bucket and rags, and there, under the dim light of a kerosene lamp, he began to clean. The room was always a stinking mess, not like those in the temples he'd lived in. Public toilets in Japan at that time were notorious for being undertended. As a freshman at Komazawa University, Shunryu had taken it upon himself to do this onerous task before his classmates arose. As head monk at Kenko-in, one of his responsibilities had been to clean the toilets and sinks, and he was determined that in the midst of his studies and activities in Tokyo, he would not forget that he was a monk. I wanted to practice true practice, and I wanted to know what the way-seeking mind is in its true sense. I thought to do something good might be the way-seeking mind. It was especially important to him not to be seen. He was convinced that if others knew what he was up to, he would no longer be involved in pure practice. He'd listen for sounds of stirring and stick his head out in the hall periodically to see if a light was on. He particularly didn't want to be found out by Nukarya Sensei, the president of the school and his most important role model during this period. Nukarya stayed in a private room in the dorm during the week to be near his students, only seeing his family on Saturday evenings and Sunday. He had impeccable humility and dignity. Visitors would often think he was a janitor. His presence had further inspired Shunryu to take on this lowly duty. But if his light was on, Shunryu would get flustered and make an escape. At first he felt good about what he was doing, but more and more he analyzed the purity of his intention. He obsessed. Why am I doing this? Do I really like doing it without being noticed? Do I actually wish to be found out? I was mixed up, and my mind was always wandering, trying to get things straight. I was not so sure of the purity of my way-seeking mind. Should I continue or not? I didn't want to have this type of silly problem, but my nature was pretty stubborn, and I didn't want to give up on something so easily. One day in psychology lecture, the professor, Iriya Yoshitaka, started talking about the impossibility of repeating experience. You might think you can do so, his professor said, but that's just thinking, and thinking about an experience and the experience itself are not the same. He added that it was impossible to catch the mind of the past, to know what we have done, or even to know the mind that is acting right now. So I was enlightened, laughing. Okay, I understood that what is not possible to think about, forget about. No wonder it was so difficult to understand my mind. I had this kind of realization. Since then, I have given up trying to be sure of my way-seeking mind. I have done things just because they were good, without analyzing them. Whether or not people saw me was not my problem anymore. Shunryu kept up his early morning cleaning of the laboratory with a more light-hearted approach, and he continued learning about the way-seeking mind from his college teachers. His years of Zen practice had opened his ears. It was necessary, he realized, to have what Dogen called enlightenment after enlightenment with no trace of enlightenment. Suzuki often used the phrase "things as it is" on purpose, as in the following quote. Zen is the teaching of accepting things as it is and of raising things as they go. This is the fundamental purpose of our practice. But it is difficult to see things as it is. I don't mean that there is a distortion of sight, but that as soon as you see something, you already start to intellectualize it. As soon as you intellectualize something, it is no longer what you saw. In education class, a professor said something that further inspired Shunryu to drop his hindsight and foresight and live directly in each moment. He couldn't believe what the professor had said, but he checked his notes against those of a fellow student, and they were the same. Formal education is to explain what is and what it means. Actual education is to let it be whatever it is without explanation. He couldn't accept that at first, but he came to see the connection that one had to begin practice without knowing the way-seeking mind and for a long, long time to go round and round in the same area until you get tired of trying to understand. To do something without thinking is the most important point in understanding ourselves. When you want to see, or to be sure of your mind, you cannot catch it. But when you just do something, and when your mind is just acting as it is, that is how you catch your mind in the true sense. On August 21st, 1926, in a private ceremony at Rinso-in, Shunryu Suzuki received Shiho, Dharma transmission from So-on. He was 22. In Shiho, the disciple receives his master's robe and his place in the lineage. It symbolizes the passing of Buddha's mind from generation to generation. Buddha meets Buddha. Shunryu knew that it was just a formality and that he had a long way to go to understand the teaching of Buddha. So-on wanted Shunryu and his family to be responsible for Zo-nin, and the ceremony authorized the transfer. Though Shunryu could now wear the brown robes instead of the monk's black, he would not change colors. That would be presumptuous. And though he was now his own man, he was still called Crooked Cucumber by So-on, who would continue to be in charge of his life for many years to come. This was a big event for Sogaku as well. He retired as abbot of Shoganji, leaving it to a priest from Shizuoka, and finally moved with his wife Yone and daughter Aiko back to Zo-nin to be Inkyo, retired master. So-on was still the abbot of Zo-nin in name, but Shunryu's family resided there and was in charge. Fall arrived and Shunryu's fortunes took a change for the worse. He had always had a weak constitution and was especially susceptible to respiratory illness. He'd been coughing constantly for weeks and had missed a lot of classes. Dr. Yoshikawa, his patron, was now living with his family near their Tokyo home. He visited Shunryu in the dorm and immediately had him hospitalized. He had tuberculosis, a mild case, but any case of TB was taken very seriously. It was career-threatening and life-threatening. He needed total rest and hospital care. Fortunately, the disease did not progress, and after a while, Shunryu was well enough to leave. He moved out of the dorm and into Dr. Yoshikawa's house, remaining there after he had recovered, until the doctor said he could start attending classes again. In 1926, Shunryu had completed his head monk training, entered the university, received transmission from So-on, and developed tuberculosis. One last important event in his life and in the lives of all Japanese would transpire at the end of that year. On December 25th, the invalid emperor died, and his son, Hiroshito, became the new emperor. The imperial year was no longer Taisho 12, but Showa 1, a year that would last for 10 days and usher in a new era of hope, Showa, enlightened peace. Whatever the teaching may be, the teaching confronts each in accordance with the circumstances. On a hot, muggy day in mid-July 1927, during summer vacation in his second year at college, Shunryu was on his way back to Dr. Yoshikawa's after doing some errands when he realized he was not far from Miss Ransom's house. Nona Ransom, a striking 40-year-old woman from England, was his English teacher at Komazawa. His friend and fellow student Kundo, who lived with her, had pointed out the building to Shunryu and urged him to drop by sometime, saying she always had something cold for the intolerable afternoons. Shunryu wanted to get out of the heat, so he gathered his courage and went to Miss Ransom's. It was a formidable place. A traditional wooden house with white stucco between the beams and around the shoji, enclosed within a solid wall and in a wealthy neighborhood in the Shibuya section of Tokyo. He entered the gate and decided to go to the back door, having never before approached a foreigner's house. Japanese slide open the door and make themselves known with a formal greeting from the entryway. He knew the English didn't do that. They knock or ring or something, so he just called out from the back door without opening it. In a moment she appeared and most graciously invited him into a sitting room near the kitchen. It was a fine home on the inside as well. There were chairs and a high table, a Turkish rug in the hall, and it was neat and clean, more so than many Japanese homes and temples. She asked if he'd like something to drink. Shunryu said water would be fine. She went to the kitchen and came back with cold watermelon. Shunryu had been Miss Ransom's best student right from the start of his classes with her, having studied English hard for some years, and he was eager to make the most of this precious chance to learn conversation with a native speaker. There was almost no emphasis on conversation in the study of any foreign language in Japan. The main point of such learning, since the gates had opened, was to read technical books in order to copy foreign technology. When the political winds blew to the right, any other interest was considered almost unpatriotic. Of course, there was always the need for diplomats and translators, and there were that handful of students like Shunryu who had their own goals. Over watermelon, Miss Ransom asked Shunryu if he might be available to assist her. She said she needed help with shopping and communicating with Japanese guests and private students. She didn't speak any Japanese and had great difficulty in communication. Shunryu tactfully pointed out that she already had Kundo and another boy living there, and they were both her English students. She said that the other boy would leave soon and that she'd like Shunryu to consider taking his place. Shunryu started helping Miss Ransom right away. On the 1st of August, he moved into the room with the other boys, and soon there were only Kundo and Shunryu. Dr. Yoshikawa was sorry to see him go, but knew that this was an important opportunity. He would continue his support, and Shunryu would likewise keep in touch and help his sons with their English studies. After a while, Kundo moved out too, leaving Shunryu alone with Miss Ransom. This meant that he was busy indeed with his schoolwork as well as her training and various personal needs. It had soon become clear to him why the other boys didn't stay long. She was not an easy person to be with. She was quite strict and stubborn, and she tried to force her English ways on us and on Japanese people in general, and she always had some complaint. Mostly what I had to do was listen to her complaints about Japanese people, what happened at school, what happened in the car. She was always complaining about Japan. I was the only person who would listen, but I also complained a lot to her. After Shunryu's many years of study with Sohn, Miss Ransom was really not so hard to take. Shunryu was enthusiastic. He and Miss Ransom were close and worked well together despite their squabbles. At first, his English was not adequate, but his ability to communicate progressed rapidly, especially since there was so much talking going on, much more than he was used to in Japanese company. She had an active social life, so Shunryu not only got to translate, but to speak English with other foreigners from England, America, Europe, and even China. In that era, when a man and a woman went down the street together, it was almost always a husband with his wife walking behind him. Miss Ransom and Shunryu made a sight going down the street side by side, talking and even laughing at times. He was 23 that fall and she was 40. Shunryu's short among his countrymen was 4 feet 11. At almost 6 feet, Miss Ransom was lean yet shapely, beautiful and stately, and her bowl-shaped gray hat made her seem even taller. Her nose was long and straight, her eyes round and wide, her eyebrows thick and expressive. They both walked erect, energetically, Shunryu in his uniform and she in her subdued dresses and heavy overcoat as winter set in. At first, the neighbors said she had a new houseboy, but in time, people said she had a live-in interpreter. As they returned home, Shunryu would often be carrying her baggages, just as he'd done for Sohn. In fact, Shunryu's relationship with Miss Ransom had a number of parallels to his early apprenticeship to Sohn. They were both demanding, eccentric, ornery, and dignified. His life revolved around theirs. They had knowledge he wanted, and despite their faults, he loved them. But there were differences. Miss Ransom treated Shunryu much more like an equal. She was direct and opinionated, but let him speak his mind as well. She was still his teacher, landlady, and employer, and he treated her with a level of respect that satisfied her proper English standards. But he could never have talked back to Sohn the way he did to her. Shunryu was incurably curious, and Miss Ransom was quite forthcoming about her life. He learned a great deal more about her than he ever had about anyone else. She was the 9th child born in Bedford, England, on October 5th, 1887. Before coming to Japan, she had spent 3 years in Tianjin in northern China, teaching at the grammar school for the British concession. She also tutored privately. Among her students were the children of the President of China, Li Yuahung, and those of Shigeru Yoshida, the Japanese consul. It was through Yoshida that further doors began to open for Miss Ransom. When the former emperor of China, Puyi, and his wife, Wan Jung, fled the Japanese legation in Peking in 1925 and escaped to Tianjin, Yoshida arranged for Miss Ransom to be companion and English teacher to the former empress, and subsequently to the former emperor as well. Through Yoshida, Miss Ransom came to Japan in 1927 and moved into a house that his parents owned. There she taught at 3 colleges. She was also the teacher of the English language and foreign etiquette under the imperial household. Among her students was Jigoro Kano, the founder of modern judo and president of the school attended by members of the royal family. One day, Miss Ransom asked Shunryu to buy some large daffodil bulbs. When she saw what he got, she said, "These are too small. Get me some big ones." So he looked all over the Shibuya section of Tokyo, going to several florists and buying the biggest bulbs he could find. Still, she wasn't satisfied. That got him angry. He came back later with a bag and told her, "I got some very big daffodil bulbs. Here they are." Then he got scared and sneaked away. She was quite pleased until she opened the bag and smelled them. "These are onions." He knew she detested onions. She started shouting and searching the house for him. Then he burst out laughing in his hiding place, and she came at him with the onions held high. He ran up the stairs with her chasing after him, but he was faster and went to the roof and hid. One kind word can turn over all of heaven and earth. On days when Shunryu's classes were over early enough and Miss Ransom was not busy, they would have high tea in her sitting room. He learned about her youth and studies in England, Belgium, and France, of her graduate work in education at the Bedford Froebel Training College, where she became head of the preparatory school, of her 10 years as form mistress at the Edinburgh Institute in Scotland, and of her decision to go to China at the age of 37. She was particularly fond of her memories of the young empress, Wan Jung, beautiful countenance, a lovely though tragic figure. She had married Puyi at 14, just 1 year older than his second wife, and when only 16, she had latched on to Miss Ransom as a pillar of sanity in her bizarre and treacherous circumstances. A picture of the Empress stood atop a chest in the corner of the sitting room. Shunryu was curious about Miss Ransom's approach to Christianity, a subject which he knew little about. Christianity was said to be like Amida Buddhism, more faith-oriented, relying on other power as opposed to the self-power of Zen. Christians were generally respected in Japan as sincere and devoted to good works. Jesuits had founded one of the first universities in Japan, Sophia, in Tokyo, and some of them had a keen interest in Rinzai Zen. Japanese Christians had known periods of persecution and favor, but they never made as much progress as Christians in China and Korea. Miss Ransom had no respect for Catholicism or Buddhism. She had been born into a Quaker family. Theirs was a simple, straightforward approach to truth, without many of the common forms of religion, since Quakers use no statues or images of God or Jesus and refuse to recognize any tie between state and religious authority, such as the taking of oaths. Quakers are pacifists, and though Miss Ransom taught the children of generals, she was not fond of the militaristic trappings of governments in the East or West. She did not like the increasing role of the Japanese military that she had seen in northern China, where they had ostensibly come to guard the train lines. She especially resented suggestions by certain high officials that she might be able to use her sway with ex-Emperor Puyi to Japan's benefit. But she said little about all this. She merely rose above it and set out to do what good she could. After her years in China and Japan, Miss Ransom was convinced that Buddhism was a cult of idol worship, worthy of no more than a passing glance for the sake of a better understanding of history and culture. She visited sacred buildings and was quite taken by the architecture and art, the gardens and sculpture, but she shook her head when she saw believers bowing and making offerings before statues. It bothered her slightly that her houseboy was to be a priest of one of these temples. It created an uncomfortable gap between them. And then there was her statue of the Buddha. In Japan, outdoor shoes customarily go on a wooden rack just inside the front door, before the step up into the house proper, where the indoor slippers are. Shoes, or zori, never touch the floors of the interior. The surface outside is dirty. Outside shoes are dirty. Inside floors and slippers are clean. The two do not mix. The statue was in the sitting room, a small, attractive space with tatami floors and smooth clay walls between dark brown wooden posts. Extending half the length of the wall opposite the entrance was an alcove called the tokonoma. The statue sat in the tokonoma. The tokonoma is in some ways the center of a Japanese home. It is not an altar, but a nook on the floor for a flower arrangement in a treasured vase, possibly a special stone or an antique, and a hanging scroll. The tokonoma is the family's aesthetic altar to nature, art, and wisdom. Miss Ransom hung no scroll in her tokonoma, nor did she include any vase of flowers. Instead, on a stone pedestal, there was a beautiful foot-high carved Buddha statue. She made clear to Shunryu that this sitting Buddha figure was there solely for aesthetic and sentimental values and not for any religious purposes. It had been a gift to her from Puyi. Miss Ransom kept her shoes in the tokonoma as well, right next to the statue. Shunryu told himself that she was not a Buddhist and it didn't matter, but still it was hard for him to take. It embarrassed him when she'd come home from school and slip off her shoes and put them right next to the Buddha statue. One morning, before he went to school, Shunryu quietly entered the sitting room where Miss Ransom sat drinking her black tea and cream. He had some tea, too, hot green tea in a small Japanese cup. He held it carefully with both hands, but did not sit down with Miss Ransom to drink it. Instead, he lifted it above his eyes and then placed it softly before the Buddha, bowed in gassho, a standing bow with palms together, and left the room as quietly as he'd entered. This is what he would later call the beginning of the Cold War. Weeks passed, and every morning Shunryu would offer tea and bow to the statue of Buddha. Miss Ransom at first just watched him, but increasingly she expressed amusement and began to tease him. He didn't try to explain himself, and she didn't ask him to. They were getting along fine in terms of shopping and meals, but the Cold War persisted. Miss Ransom would tell her guests about her houseboy's strange behavior toward the Buddha statue and the shoes next to it. The shoes were always straight, as they were in Japanese entryways, and he lined them up from the left so that they'd be as far from the Buddha statue as space would allow. "Shunryu's being a very naughty little boy," she said, pointing out a cup of tea before the statue. Her guests would join in the ridicule, not realizing how much he understood. Often he would find newly placed cigarette butts, burned matches, and used toothpicks lying in the Buddha's hands. He did not remove them, but continued his practice of offering tea and, at times, incense. Meanwhile, he also prepared for the hot war, the war of words, which he knew was to come. He pondered skillful means and took to studying English in his room with increased concentration. He sought help from a professor of Buddhism at Komazawa, with whom he worked out translations of basic technical terms. He made a list. In particular, he studied the vocabulary that might explain to a Westerner what Buddhism was and why Buddhists make offerings to statues. For the first 300 years or so, Buddhism had had no physical representation of Buddha. The Greek-influenced artisans who stayed behind at Gandhara in present-day Afghanistan after Alexander's push into India made some of the first known Buddhist icons with a human image. The idea caught on. It might seem easier to explain Buddhism without having to justify any particular forms or practices. Dogen wrote that offering incense is a good practice, but not necessary, that only zazen is necessary to follow the way. But instead of saying something like, "Oh, it's just a piece of wood," as some early masters had said, Shunryu would not deny the statue, but included it as part of his practice and as a way to get through to Miss Ransom. He savored the opportunity to communicate, but didn't make a move. Miss Ransom and her friends continued to tease him. He ignored them. He knew that her curiosity was mounting and that eventually there would come a chance to explain what Buddhism is. One rainy morning in the sitting room, after several weeks of Cold War, the moment he had waited for arrived. Shunryu and Miss Ransom had no classes or appointments and no desire to leave the comfortable protection of her roof and walls. As she sat sipping her tea, a silence came over her, and she sighed, lost in thought. "Tell me something, please, Shunryu. Please tell me why on earth you worship that Buddha statue. You seem like a reasonable young man, and you are obviously sincere, but I just cannot understand what you find so compelling in this superstitious nonsense." So he told her why he related to the statue with such respect, and he told her about Shakyamuni Buddha and Buddhahood. He said that such a statue reminds us that the way is everywhere, that we ourselves are Buddha, so that when we offer incense to the statue, we are recognizing our own true nature, the true nature of all that is. The nature of our existence is not something we can know or remember so easily. Buddha is not a god or a being who can be easily described. You can't put your finger on what Buddha is, but Buddhism does have various teachings. There is, for instance, the teaching about the three bodies of Buddha, the sublime, indescribable Dharmakaya Buddha, beyond any particular experience, the first principle of religion. The Sambhogakaya Buddha, the subtle body of rapture or grace, the fruit of practice, and the Nirmanakaya Buddha, the historical person who awakened under the Bodhi tree. He was a person just like everyone else who attained something wonderful that is possible for others to attain, women and men. Maybe these aspects of Buddha have something in common with the Christian concepts of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, he explained. But to understand these bodies of Buddha or to deeply know ourselves, it isn't helpful to think about it too much. That's why Buddhists apply themselves wholeheartedly to experience direct insight of the truth through meditation and other mindful practices like chanting and offering incense or tea to a statue of a Buddha. Miss Ransom was amazed. It was not at all what she had expected. She thanked him for his explanation and praised his command of English. She said she had no idea that there was such profundity in Buddhism, such realization of the divinity of the individual. She was not only affected by Shunryu's explanation, but was also impressed with his composure and delivery. After that, there was no more teasing. Miss Ransom became very quiet for a few days. Then, one afternoon, Shunryu walked into the sitting room and saw that the shoes were gone from the tokonoma, and there was a fine arrangement of flowers by the wooden Buddha. She asked if he would tell her more about Buddhism and explain Buddhist practice. He showed her how he would clean the tokonoma, and together they went out and got some candles, incense, and an incense bowl, even a little bell, and they turned the tokonoma into an altar. He taught her how to sit zazen. They made the acquaintance of Buddhist professors at Komazawa who could speak some English, and she set about studying Buddhism. Shunryu studied English all the harder and was pleased at what had happened. They were freely trading in the knowledge of their respective religious traditions. The wall between them had fallen, and she'd come walking through the opening. This affair of the Buddha statue was momentous for Suzuki, literally changing the course of his life. He would later call it the turning point of his life. He had seen that Miss Ransom's total ignorance of Buddhism, her beginner's mind, was not an obstacle, but had made it possible for her to understand more clearly. He talked to Miss Ransom about his dream to go abroad, admitting that he had become fairly disgusted with the state of Buddhism and the attitude of many priests in Japan. I felt very good. I developed some confidence in our teaching and in the thought that I could help Western people understand Buddhism. For Japanese people, it is pretty difficult to study Buddhism in its true sense because the tradition has been so often mistaken and misunderstood. It is difficult to change misunderstandings once we have them. But for people who don't know anything about Buddhism, it's like painting on white paper. It's much easier to give them the right understanding. I think that the experience I had with Miss Ransom resulted in my coming to America. Moment after moment, completely devote yourself to listening to your inner voice. There was a Western-style rattan bed and chair at Zonin, especially purchased for Miss Ransom's visits. Shunryu would take her to Rinso Inn as well. The monks got to know the English lady, as well as all the people in the villages of Mori below Zonin and Sakamoto below Rinso Inn. A foreigner in those parts was a distinct oddity. Their relationship was the first thing people would mention when Shunryu-san's name came up. The second was his absent-mindedness. Sometimes the two qualities came together. The first time Shunryu took Miss Ransom to Rinso Inn, he left her luggage at the Yaizu station and had to take the commercial horse-drawn buggy back 5 miles to get it. As Shunryu rode off, Son called out to him as he had often in the past, "Oh, this forgetful boy! What can we do about him?" Son knew just what to do about Shunryu. He gave him a lot more to keep track of by passing Zonin on to him, this time officially. On January 22nd, 1929, at the age of 24, Shunryu was installed by Son as the 28th abbot of Zonin in the mountain seat ceremony. The evening before, there was a ceremony in which Son stepped down, and the next day, Shunryu ascended the mountain seat and assumed the title of Jushoku, abbot. Sogaku would continue to run the temple, now for his son rather than for Son. Through years of effort, Shunryu had regained for his father his lost temple. It had been possible only because that wasn't Shunryu's main goal. In Tokyo, Shunryu continued to be immersed in his dual life as a college student and Miss Ransom's companion. Her interest in Buddhism continued, but not to the exclusion of her many other pursuits such as art, socializing, and arguing with Shunryu. Then, one April day, while the cherry trees were blooming, something happened to Shunryu that made him decide to move back into the dorm. This was brought home to me the day I went to the Turkish embassy on some business for Miss Ransom. I was speaking in English with an assistant to the ambassador, and as I looked at him, the thought came, maybe someday I shall be like you. This scared me. If I stay with Miss Ransom, will I become an ambassador and not a priest? He went home and told Miss Ransom that it would be best for his studies if he moved out for his last year at Komasawa University. Miss Ransom sadly acquiesced. On May 30th, 1929, Shunryu moved into a Komasawa dorm. One day, Shunryu and several other monk students went to the docks of Yokohama Harbor to see off a priest named Daito Suzuki, who was leaving for Los Angeles. There he would assist Hosen Isobe Roshi at the recently founded Zen Shuji, a temple for Japanese Americans. Isobe had plans to start another temple in San Francisco, and Daito would eventually take charge of Zen Shuji. Most Japanese could not understand why anyone, especially a Buddhist priest, would want to leave Japan. But Shunryu and his friends greeted Daito with enthusiasm. To this little group of Komasawa students, his departure was heroic. When the ship pulled out, the young monks on the dock cheered, and tears streamed down Shunryu's face. 30 years later, Shunryu and Daito's paths would cross again, and again memorably, though their roles at the time would be quite different. On January 14th, 1930, an important public ceremony for Shunryu Zonin called 10A acknowledged Shunryu Suzuki's Dharma transmission from Soon. For Miss Ransom, he defined it as a public determination and consent from the Sotoshu to be a chief priest and to teach Zen. A special brown robe was handed down to him by Soon in the incense and flower-filled main hall. Short recitations were interspersed with longer recitations chanted and mumbled by attending priests and punctuated by bells and drums. The final 10A ceremony gave Shunryu-san institutional credentials. The whole community turned out for this big occasion, as did Miss Ransom, Dr. Yoshikawa's family, friends from school, and various priests and teachers he'd studied with. The next day he left by train for the two head temples of the Soto school, Eiheiji and Sojiji, for ceremonies in which he was honorary abbot of each for a day. This was the last of the ceremonies between Soon and Shunryu. His father would continue to be acting abbot while Shunryu finished his studies. That could go on indefinitely as far as Shunryu was concerned. He had other things in mind. Sogaku was old, but still in good health, and his Dharma brothers and fellow disciples of Soon, Kendo, and Soko would occasionally come from Rinso-in to help him. At the late age of 25, on April 10, 1930, Shunryu graduated from Komazawa University, second in his class in Buddhist and Zen philosophy with a minor in English. His graduate thesis, written under his academic advisor and the school's president, Nukariya Kaiten, focused on the relationship between master and disciple, as discussed by Dogen in an essay of the Shobo Genzo featuring submission to the master. It is called Raihai Tokuzui, Bowing and Acquiring the Essence. It's a chapter in which Dogen also forcefully asserts the equality of women. In his thesis, Shunryu leaned toward Nukariya's religious experience point of view rather than Buddhism as philosophy. In America, when asked about it, Shunryu simply said his thesis was on bowing. Another key professor whose instruction influenced Shunryu's thesis was Sokuo Eto, an eminent Shobo Genzo scholar who emphasized an open-minded approach to study integrated with Zazen in Buddhist practice. Eto had been a classmate of Soon's, and they had studied together with Okasotan. Like many of Shunryu's professors, he was also a priest with a temple back home, and, like Nukariya, he emphasized religion over philosophy, direct experience over systemization. Not long after he graduated from college, Shunryu was honored with another credential that he greatly valued. On the recommendation of Shundo Tachibana, a dean of the school, he received government certification to be, as he translated it, a teacher of the English language and ethical conduct for high school boys, a respected and almost professorial status. since high schools then were roughly equivalent to today's junior colleges. Shunryu, now finished with his formal education, had moved his books and wardrobe from the Komazawa dorm to Zonin. But he did not want to settle down there. He had bigger ideas. When Son came to Zonin, Shunryu asked if they could speak. He'd been building up his courage for this encounter. Shunryu described his experience with Miss Ransom and what it had meant to him. He described seeing Daito Suzuki off at Yokohama Harbor. Son listened silently. Then Shunryu got to the point. He suggested that he go abroad to teach Buddhism anywhere. It didn't matter where, say, America. No, Son replied. How about Hawaii? No. Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan, was a kind of frontier, and there were a lot of foreigners in Sapporo who wouldn't know about Buddhism. No. Shunryu persevered too long. Son became infuriated. Here, he yelled, smashing his fist on the table. It was just one word with some percussion, but his anger filled volumes. He was so furious. I knew there must be some reason why, and I knew that he loved me very much. So I gave up my notion of going abroad. I completely gave up my idea of going to America. So chapter 3 starts off in 1924, April. Shunryu's almost 20s in a preparatory school for going to college. And he goes to the Yokohama docks to walk around. He's looking at what's being exported. And he's profoundly embarrassed. It's just a bunch of crap, and it's not. And he's so embarrassed because he loves Japan and Japanese culture and Japanese Zen and Japanese art and crafts. He loves what he considers really, really good. But there's all sorts of levels of quality down to what he doesn't consider really, really good, and it's that stuff that he sees them exporting, and it really upsets him. I remember when I was a kid, things coming from Japan, Japanese products in general, did not yet have a good reputation. They had a reputation of being flimsy or, being sort of, junky or, and also that they'd fall apart. And I remember something about early Japanese cars like when Westerners would use them, they'd slam a door and it would fall off. I remember that. I don't know how true it is or how often it was. Philip Wilson, who you will definitely meet later, one of Suzuki's early disciples. He asked Suzuki, and Philip went to Japan and went to Aiheiji and did very well. He asked Suzuki, why do Japanese make their teacups so thin and delicate so they break? And Suzuki said, well, it's not that they're too delicate, but that we handle them well. With Suzuki, you adjust yourself to the environment and don't expect the environment to adjust to you. You adjust yourself as much as possible to other people and not trying to get them to adjust to you. And that extends to things too. But on the other hand, Here's an example when he is embarrassed and upset about what he sees Japan sharing with foreign countries. Here's an example of him not wanting to adjust to it. He wants to improve on it. There's every level of quality in Japan, in everything. I mean, that's what it seemed like to me. And one thing that attracted a lot of nippophiles or Japan lovers is the very high quality of art, religion, crafts, dance, food, what a food trip, clothing, the material, what they do with the shelter, their buildings, the architecture. There's just no end to the wonderful stuff there. But you got to seek it out because there's no end to the unwonderful stuff too. And that's more in your face. And eccentrics. You know, a lot of times when we generalize, we talk about, what we meet with the average people. But they have a real strong tradition of eccentrics. Sort of like England does. Well, they're both island imperialist countries. Theater, so many things. You get into it, so subtle and so wonderful. But if you live there, you find that's just one level. I mean, it's not one level, it's a whole complex universe of levels of wonderful high quality stuff. But there's a whole universe of low quality stuff and icky stuff. And expats living in a foreign country a lot of times just sitting around complaining about all the things that are bothering them. Like Suzuki said, Miss Ransom did. I know Elin and I got really tired of cute. There is so much cute. Cartoon characters, smiley faces, bunny rabbits. It could drive you crazy, and you just keep running into it all the time. One thing about the really high quality stuff is you got to seek it out. You will find, wonderful friends, people you're compatible with. You've got to have things to do, things to study if you live in Japan. People who went there to teach English, is my observation, and did not get involved in some sort of spiritual practice and artistic practice, in the language, in the culture, and seek out the best and what was inspiring to them. Those who were just trying to make money, and you could make a lot of money when I was there. We made very good money, 88 to 92, height of their economy. But the people who were just there for the money or for a job would get depressed. It's not rewarding at that level, I saw people leave Japan to go to Thailand to teach, like Cambodian refugees on the border in camps for, volunteer work to have some rewarding experiences because they hadn't sought them out in Japan. They'd just been after money. But you could spend a lifetime on the wonderful things in Japan and the wonderful people. I came back from Japan once, and I said to Fred Harriman, I said, "Oh, Fred, I was just in Kyoto, and it's so wonderful, just all the little nooks and crannies you can find there. It was so fascinating, and you're walking in a neighborhood and you come across a shrine you didn't even know was there, or a little tea shop or something." And I guess he was feeling a little cynical that day, whatever his last experience was. He said, "Yes, that's what's good about it. The rest is all Velveeta." That story about Suzuki impaling his eye, above his eye, in a storeroom. I heard him tell that story, and it made quite an impression on me. but nobody else told it. And I was surprised. I wanted to include it in the book, but I needed a little more. I needed to fill it in some. And then finally, Henry Schaefer remembered it. And Henry Schaefer brought it up in an interview. And if you look at Henry's interview, he really filled it in. And then I learned more about it. I can't remember where. Like Carl Bielefeld said, I sympathize with you, Carl. Where's all the source notes and stuff? It's all scattered. It's like it's in a big pile. And some of it's there and some of it's not. So much of what I wrote was from memory. Henry thought it happened at Heiheiji, but I didn't think so. I thought it happened earlier, but we don't know where. You know what that story was like to me? The way it came together, it was like being an archaeologist and coming upon these shards of some sort of pottery that from an ancient civilization, and it's like really important. You pick up this piece and that piece, and you start putting it together, and then you don't have all of them, but it starts getting the idea, the shape of it, and this and that. That's the way this story was coming together, and it's a great story. I'm glad it. Thanks, Henry. You really made it. Henry is no longer with us. He's one of the people that was involved with Suzuki early and Trungpa early, and Henry has great stories. You know how it talks about how the Suzuki's Shuso ceremony, where the answers were memorized. Not only were the answers memorized and classical, but the questions were too. It's more like being actors in a theater, that you really respect the author, like being in Shakespeare, but in this case you're being in the realm of the great masters of Zen. When we first learned about that from Kobun Chino at Tassajara, we said, what? They memorize the questions and answers? Well, that's terrible. Because, the Shuso here, they have to, it's called Dharma combat, the Shuso ceremony. They have to answer the questions that people ask them, and sometimes people are trying to stick it to them. Usually not. Usually they're throwing softballs. But, no, as he said, it's done that way sometimes in Japan, too. But both ways are good. And Yoshimura said the same thing, a priest who followed Kobun and assisted there. Ryogen Yoshimura, wonderful man. May he rest in peace. And Kobun, I say Kobun is Kobun Chino, who was the first priest to come help us, but you'll learn plenty about him. Anyway, they both said that it's just as good, memorizing it, that the whole, where you're at comes through in that just as well. And I can appreciate that now. And another thing that people at say the San Francisco Zen Center, I don't know what happens in the other centers, but, when people are Shuso or head monk, it's for a practice period. And we have them in, at Tassajara in the city and at Green Gulch Farm. When people who've been through that, they read that Suzuki was going to college while he was Shuso. But actually, what he went through was considered pretty good, because, but my understanding, I don't know what percentage, but a majority of the priests in Japan have more of just a symbolic being Shuso. And only very few get to be the head monk at one of the training temples for a full, 100-day practice period. But his spirit and determination come through pretty well. Pronunciation comment. Without thinking, when I came to Hirohito, the Japanese emperor, I just said Hiroshito. Where I was in Japan, people tended to say it like that. It depends on the person. But there are places in Japan where it's pronounced more like Hirohito, and places where the HI is pronounced SHI, Hiroshito. And then we come to Miss Nona Ransom. Good Lord, I have so much on Miss Ransom, I could do a whole podcast just on her. The book says she's the 9th child, but should have pointed out that Nona means 9. I get messages about her every once in a while, and I just got one, and I'm going to post it, I think, for tomorrow on Cuke.com's What's New. Somebody wrote and said, I was fascinated in reading about Miss Nona Ransom on your website. She used to be my next-door neighbor. And he sent me a picture of that she'd given him of the Empress of China, Wanzhong, which I've just discovered by looking up stuff about her, that was more often called Wanrong. But I do find Wanzhong, and Nona Ransom called her Wanzhong, and so did Nona's adopted son, Harry Rose Ransom. I have so much from them. I've gotten messages from her great niece. She never married. Her great niece. One thing we have from Miss Ransom through Graham Patchy, who was one of Suzuki's early disciples and who got to know her in England, is she gave Graham film of Suzuki in the 1930s that she took. And it's on ShunryuSuzuki.com under film and video. And it's pretty good. It's on YouTube, too. YouTube video. Suzuki talked about her several times in lectures. When he was sort of forced to talk about his past some. He didn't want to do that much. But, I think he was in the introduction to Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. Richard Baker said he never talked about his past. Well, that's true. He didn't much. But when you're going through 3,000 pages of lectures and adding up everything you remember and that everybody you can find remembers, we got enough. We got enough. And he did say, if I'm remembered in this way, all is lost. You'll get to that later. He did enjoy talking about Miss Ransom. His talk starts off, she was my old girlfriend. And she wasn't that type of girlfriend, which Don Latin, the San Francisco Chronicle religion teacher, wondered if they were lovers. No, I don't think so. I don't think they'd really fit. Not teacher, you idiot, writer. I do that. Say the wrong nouns, pull the wrong nouns out of my head. It's a bonus with advancing years. But and I don't think that Suzuki was sexually active yet at that age. But of course, I don't know. They're not a puritanical society for sure. But one important thing about her, I didn't make this point, and I should have, is that he called her a teacher of English conversation. And I did mention that studying foreign languages was mainly done so you could read technical books and stuff. And not only was she a teacher of conversation, but then he got to live with her and have lots of conversation with her and other people. And that gave him a real a real background, although he says he just completely forgot it. However, things come back. I know from my own experience. And it mentions that he taught her how to sit zazen. Well, she's a Quaker. And, of course, there's different types of Quakers. But I've been to her Quaker church in England with Graham Patchy. And they meditate. And so there's a real, because of that background, that Quaker background, there was a connection there. Quakers have long been interested in Buddhism, and probably more than any non-Catholic group. That's what I've noticed. I drove Suzuki to a Quaker meeting in Stockton. Dan Welsh grew up in a Quaker family. His parents were Quakers. And I drove Suzuki to their Quaker meeting place. Philip Wilson was with us. And, we'd sit in like pews, as I recall. Well, that was in England with Ms. Ransom's. I don't remember how we sat in the Quaker meeting in Stockton. Then a person, if they get moved, if they feel the inspiration, they can speak up. It's not like Zazen. The teacher can do that, but the students can't. Anyway, we're going to hear more about Miss Ransom. One thing I changed from the book in the Miss Ransom part there is that it was talking about how she's a Quaker, she's a Christian, but that Japanese respected Christians. And it said that the Jesuits had founded the first university. I can't find corroboration for that, so I'm changing it from the first to one of the early universities. I mean, the Jesuits founded Sophia in 1908. There's two dates, 1908, 1913. Anyway, Keio University, Keio Daigaku, was founded in 1858, 5 years after Admiral Berry brought his ships in, and Japan opened up as an institution to study Western things, so, they could build battleships and stuff themselves. Anyway, I've learned it advisable to beware of comparatives, superlatives and comparatives. You're on much safer ground if you don't get into that. Also extremes, words, I don't know what to call them, like never and always. The thing about Japanese respected Christians back then, that was true. In my experience, that was true when I lived there too. I found that Japanese in general, usually when I generalize about Japanese, I'm not talking about my friends who are like more international people. I'm just talking about the average Japanese that I kept having experience with. And of course, I had friends among them too, but not sort of peer international type friends. That's what I see when I'm around is there's international people. Their identity is not as strongly with their own country. It's and it tends to be less ethnocentric and more sophisticated, more widely educated, that sort of thing. My experience was that people tended to respect Christians. They didn't want to be one. And Japan has a very low rate of Christianity. Like over in Korea, it's like half. In Japan, it was more like 5%. They just never could take hold. Japan has such a strong culture that really binds people together. Bali's like that too. They're very similar in that way. They take in the new. They're thirsty for the new, but they preserve their cultures in a sense because they don't integrate and homogenize everything. Their original culture is that, although it's always changing, it is nothing like it used to be, and it's been changed a lot by Westerners. But anyway, the traditional-based stuff remains very strong in both countries. What I would find is that many people felt that there was a lot of hypocrisy and, high living among priests, or, they knew there were some good priests, but they tended to have, I just hear it over and over, a negative view, but the Christians, they thought of the Christians as the ones who helped people, who cared about people. I had a doctor student who he said he was probably the only surgeon in Japan who was interested in hospice. And he was studying English with me in preparation for going to England to do hospice work. And when I told him that the Buddhist group I was with in America, the San Francisco Zen Center, had a hospice, he just couldn't believe it. He thought only Christians did that. And the Christians are the ones that help the sex workers and the women from the Philippines and Thailand and other countries who come there to work in bars and, massage parlors and stuff. So Christianity is well respected there. So the book says that Suzuki graduated from Komazawa. He graduated with a major in Buddhist and Zen philosophy and a minor in English. Now, when the translators got to that, I got a note that they're taking out philosophy and just left Buddhism and Zen, because they said there was no philosophy course being taught, Buddhism as a philosophy or whatever, officially at that time at Komazawa. Didn't happen yet. So I was going to eliminate it, but then I thought, well, where did I get that from? So I found where I got it from. I got it from Suzuki. He filled it out on his curriculum vitae, however that's pronounced. And that's what he wrote. So I thought, well, that's what he says. Something like that happened, so I'll use that too. The thesis that was on the Shobogenso Raihai Tokusui, a lot of what I say here comes from Carl Bielefeld. And there's a draft of Carl's 1998 excellent talk at Stanford Sati Foundation Shunryu Suzuki Conference on Suzuki's historical and teaching background, and it begins with a discussion of Suzuki's dissertation. So what I put in Crooked Cucumber came from that, but I also included what Suzuki said. He said, it was on bowing. And I see a note from Linda Cutts here. Linda Ruth Cutts, one of the abbots of Zen Center, abbess. I was wondering if there is any copy of the thesis that Suzuki Roshi wrote on Dogen's Raihai Tokusui. It's an interesting fascicle to me, in particular because Dogen lambasts the custom of excluding women from this sacred mountain, the Mount Hiei, and other discriminating practices. I thought it would be very interesting to read what Suzuki Roshi's commentary on this was. So she wrote that in May 29th, 2000, 20 years ago, right? And I told her then that Carl Bielefeld obtained a copy of Suzuki's thesis from Komazawa University in Tokyo. I say here years ago, oh my God. And so I assume it says DC reply. And Gil Fronsdale, and he have been working on getting it translated by somebody. And I remember Gil telling me that it was an expensive project. But I don't know what's come of that. I should find out. I haven't heard more of that. Yeah, that would be interesting to know. It'd be interesting to know. I wonder if I've got to find out how that's going, the translation of that. Toward the end of this chapter, Shunryu graduates from Komazawa. He moves his belongings into Zonin. You know what I thought of there? I made the note, life's only vacation. When I was in Japan, that's what I heard college was called. because they didn't fail people. In Japan, what people would study for was entrance exams. Now, I'm sure there's plenty of exceptions to this, and I know some people I know many people learn a lot at Japanese universities. But I would just hear so much about it. The entrance exam, and then, man, that starts in elementary school. And it's so competitive, and there's so much pressure on kids to do well in the entrance exam. That determines what school you go to. In Okayama, where I live, that's a city of 500,000. The schools were not for an area; they were for a level of how well you did in the entrance exam. At least that was one breakdown of them. I would see kids just playing video games all the time and just screwing around. And, their parents would see them. Their parents would say, oh, they're studying, It's their job to study. They don't have to do anything. They don't have to do any housework or anything. I mean, that was the general idea, right? And so college, the hard part's getting into college, man. Todai, Tokyo University, man, that's it. That's number one. You get in there, you got it made. Once you get in, that's it. You're in life's only vacation. Why? Because you don't really have to study. I mean, I swear, I was told this over and over. Peter Schneider was teaching college in Japan, and he ran into this, and he talked to me about it, and he refused to pass two students who did not come to class, and the school begged him to pass them. And he wouldn't do it. So they said, well, they're just going to take another class with somebody else so they can pass. Now, to wrap things up here, I'm going to play some bloopers. These are some snippets I saved to give examples of, where I have to say again what I just said, or tried to just say. First off, there's an inappropriate response. It's because of emotions I'm feeling, reading it, thinking about it, and the juxtaposition of what I'm saying and or what he's thinking, what we have him thinking, and the position he's in. He lay in his bed that evening, stitched up and bandaged like a pirate, and reflected on the events of the day. He ate, but something wonderful had happened. All that he would say later in his life is that he had had an important awakening experience. All that he would say later in his life was that he had had an important awakening experience. Sometimes I just screw up when I'm reading or mispronounce or stumble over a word, as in this. And again, memorably, and again, memorably. And there are coughs and burps, and I spare you an example of those, especially the latter. I guess I get a lot of oxygen in my stomach or something when I'm reading, and I tend to drink some while I'm reading, like water or coconut water or tea. But the most difficult is just when there's too much emotion upwelling, and then I have to wait for it to subside, or I'll just read a part over until I can say it. And you'll hear some long spaces here. That's where I can't talk. I'm waiting to be able, or I'd be able to talk. I'd start, it wouldn't come out right. After that, there was no more teasing. Miss Ransom became very quiet for a few days. Miss Ransom became very quiet for a few days. Then, one afternoon, Shunryu walked into the sitting room and saw that the shoes... Then, one afternoon, Shunryu walked into the sitting room and saw that the shoes were gone from the tokonoma, and there was a fine arrangement of flowers by the wooden Buddha. This affair of the Buddha statue was momentous for Suzuki. This affair of the Buddha statue was momentous for Suzuki, literally changing the course of his life. And then at the very end of the chapter, he was so furious. I knew there must be some reason why, and I knew that he loved me very much. So I gave up my notion. I gave up my notion of going abroad. I completely gave up my idea. I completely gave up my idea of going to America. He was so furious. I knew there must be some reason why, and I knew that he loved me very much. So I gave up my notion of going abroad. I completely gave up my idea of going to America.
As soon as I finished my schooling, I asked my teacher, my master, to go to America or Hawaii or something, to go to anywhere abroad. But he became furious. And she wouldn't allow me to go. So I couldn't come to America. And I gave up my notion of coming to America for a long, long time until I forget all about it.
May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Well, that wraps it up for Cuke Audio Podcast for today. Thank you for joining us. Come back next Tuesday and we'll get together again. And if you want to help keep Cuke Audio going, just go to cuke.com, cuke.com, and there's a donate link near the top and on the bottom of the page. It's also linked to from the Podbean page. We'd love for you to become a subscriber via PayPal. How about $1 a month? There is a minimum, though. It's $0. And if that's all you can set aside for Cuke, just mail an empty envelope or blow us a kiss. We're somewhere out there in cyberspace. Take care of yourself and don't let that nasty virus get near you or your loved ones. Till next week, I'm David Chadwick, the Poobah of Cuke Archives and Cuke Audio, with Doggett Bandita and Feline Cuchita, but without dearest lovely Katrinka, wishing you a grand awakening.